The film strip burned in my hands. Every frame showed it. Closer, always closer. A faceless thing in a trench coat, moving toward me while I stood frozen. The air smelled like ozone, like something not meant for this world. My mentor, Sarah, grabbed my arm, but the shelves crashed down between us. The ledger in my pocket listed the names of the dead, and her father was last. The passenger wasn't just in the photos anymore. It was here. And it was smiling. Elias Thorne leaned over the chemical bath. The sharp, vinegary sting of acetic acid prickling the inside of his nostrils. In the dim, red-washed glow of the darkroom, his world was reduced to the rhythmic sloshing of plastic trays and the steady, metronomic count under his breath. 1,000, 1,000, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp against the silence. The red safety light cast long, distorted shadows against the cinder-block walls of his Chicago basement, turning the spilled droplets of developer fluid into spots of dark blood. He watched the white rectangle of photo paper submerged in the tray. Slowly, like a ghost rising through a fog, an image began to coalesce. He had found the vintage Leica at an estate sale in Lincoln Park, tucked away in a velvet-lined case that smelled of mothballs and ancient secrets. The previous owner had been a recluse, a man who had died alone in a room full of locked trunks. Now, as the silver halides on the paper reacted to the chemicals, Elias saw the fruit of that discovery. It was a street scene from the late 70s. A crowd of people in bell-bottoms and wide collars frozen in a moment of mid-stride indifference. But as the details sharpened, Elias felt a cold finger of dread trace the length of his spine. In the background, standing near a newsstand, was a figure that didn't belong. It was a silhouette, a smudge of deep, ink-black shadow shaped like a man in a long trench coat. Elias grabbed his magnifying loupe, his thumb reflexively rubbing a clean patch on the lens with a microfiber cloth. He leaned in until his eyelashes brushed the glass. 3 1,000, 4 1,000. He compared this print to the one he had developed 10 minutes prior. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. In the previous frame, the dark figure had been a mere speck by the subway entrance. In this frame, it was 10 feet closer. It was featureless, a void in the shape of a person. But it was unmistakably moving through the frozen time of the film. The grain of the photo seemed to vibrate under his gaze, the pixels of the past screaming a warning he didn't yet know how to read. The heavy steel door of the dark room groaned on its hinges, and Elias jumped, nearly knocking over a bottle of fixer. Sarah Johnson stepped into the sliver of light, her silver hair shimmering like spun wire. She looked at the trays, then at Elias's pale, sunken face. "You look like you've been eating shadows for breakfast, Elias," she said, her voice a slow, heavy crawl that reminded him of the way the Chicago River moved in midwinter. She clicked her tongue against her teeth, a sound of structural assessment. "Sorry, doorframe," she muttered as she brushed past the wood. She adjusted her reading glasses on their silver chain, her eyes scanning the room as if checking for cracks in the foundation of reality. They walked up the narrow stairs to his main studio, a sprawling industrial loft that overlooked the jagged, gray skyline of the Loop. The air here was better, but the dust motes danced in the afternoon light like shimmering insects. Elias spread the prints across the light table, the cool glow illuminating the frantic precision of his work. "Look at the distance, Sarah. 1,000? Between the newsstand and the lamppost. It's closing the gap." Sarah leaned over, her face lined like a topographical map of a hard-lived life. She didn't speak for a long time, the only sound the distant, muffled roar of the L train passing a few blocks away. "The topography of this image is wrong," Sarah finally said, her finger tracing the edge of the dark figure. "It's like a sinkhole in the middle of a paved street. It's not just a shadow, Elias. It's an absence." She looked around the loft, her gaze lingering on the heavy metal industrial shelving that lined the western wall, loaded with decades of heavy camera gear, lead weights, and glass plates. "This building was built on swamp drainage and broken promises," she whispered, a habit of hers when the tension rose. Elias began his count again, his eyes fixed on the black trench coat in the photo, when a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the room. It wasn't the sound of wood breaking. It was the sound of reality snapping. The air in the loft suddenly turned frigid, the smell of ozone, sharp and electric, filling Elias's lungs until they burned. Without warning, the massive steel shelves began to groan. The heavy bolts anchored into the brickwork screamed as they were wrenched outward. "Sarah, move!" Elias lunged, his body a blur of desperate motion. He tackled her just as the entire wall of equipment gave way. Hundreds of pounds of iron and glass slammed into the floor where they had been standing seconds before. The crash was deafening, a cacophony of shattering lenses and twisted metal that vibrated through the floorboards and into Elias's very marrow. Dust billowed in a thick gray cloud, coating Elias's tongue with the taste of pulverized stone. He lay on the floor, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm, his arm draped protectively over Sarah. 1,000, 1,000, he gasped, trying to anchor himself as the world spun. The silence that followed was heavier than the crash. Through the haze of dust, he looked at the wreckage. His life's work, his expensive gear, lay in a heap of useless shards. But amidst the twisted metal, something caught the light. The vintage Leica had been thrown clear, its leather case split open by the force of the fall. Elias crawled toward it, his fingers trembling as he reached into the jagged tear in the case's lining. He felt something stiff, not leather, but paper. He pulled out a small, slim volume bound in black cloth. It was a ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the neat, cramped handwriting that filled the pages. It was a list of names, dates, and locations. "Sarah, look." He held the book out, his voice shaking. Beside each name, a cause of death was noted in the same clinical hand: respiratory failure, sudden lung collapse, asphyxiation. The dates stretched back to the 50s, a grim chronology of breath stolen away. Sarah took the book, her hand steady despite the chaos. She turned to the final page, her eyes widening behind her glasses. She went perfectly still, the kind of stillness a building has right before the wrecking ball hits. "Elias," she whispered, and for the first time, her voice lost its heavy, geographic certainty. "This last name, it's my father." She traced the ink, her thumb catching on the grain of the paper. "They told me it was a car accident. 1974. A rainy night on Lakeshore Drive. But he's here. He's the last one who held the camera before it went into that estate sale." The revelation hung in the air, a bridge collapsing in slow motion. Her family history wasn't a series of accidents. It was a debt being collected by something that lived in the glass. The loft felt smaller now, the high ceilings pressing down like the lid of a coffin. Elias watched Sarah, seeing the way her shoulders slumped, the way the map of her face seemed to redraw itself in lines of grief. He wanted to say something, to offer a technical explanation or a measurement of the odds. But the words died in his throat. 1,000, he whispered. But the count offered no comfort. The passenger wasn't just a smudge on a lens anymore. It was a legacy, a shadow that had been following Sarah's bloodline for decades, and now it had found a new focal point in him. Elias retreated to the bathroom, the only room with a lock and no windows. He splashed cold water on his face, the ceramic sink feeling unnaturally solid against his palms. He needed to breathe, to find the edge of the frame. He looked up into the vanity mirror, reaching for a towel. He froze. In the reflection, standing directly behind his left shoulder, was the man in the trench coat. The figure was no longer a blur. It was a solid, towering void. He could see the texture of the coat, like charcoal rubbed into paper. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. He watched through the glass as the entity's hand, long, spindly fingers made of smoke, reached out toward his neck. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, his hands coming up in a futile gesture of defense. The bathroom was empty. The only sound was the rhythmic tink, tink, tink of the leaky faucet hitting the porcelain. He turned back to the mirror, his breath coming in shallow hitches. The reflection was clear now, save for a single, hand-sized patch of fog in the center of the glass. It didn't evaporate. It stayed there, a stubborn mist in a room that was bone-dry and cold. He touched the glass, his fingers leaving streaks in the fog. But the cold he felt wasn't from the mirror. It was coming from inside his own chest. He stumbled back into the main room, where Sarah was sitting on a crate, her breath coming in ragged, wet sounds. She looked up at him, her eyes clouded with pain. "It's heavy, Elias. Like I'm breathing through wool." The smell of old tobacco smoke, sharp and stale, wafted through the loft, though neither of them smoked. It was the smell of the man in the trench coat, a ghostly residue of 1,000 dead cigarettes. Every mirror in the loft, the decorative ones, the ones on the back of the doors, suddenly gave a synchronized ping. A single hairline fracture appeared across every reflective surface, a spiderweb of silver breaking under an invisible weight. Elias grabbed a screwdriver from his toolkit, his knuckles white. "I'm taking it apart. 1/1000, I'm breaking the glass. If the lens is gone, the tether is gone." He sat at his workbench and positioned the Leica under the lamp. As he lowered the screwdriver toward the casing, the camera shuddered. The shutter fired with a sound like a gunshot. Clack hiss. Elias jumped back, his heart racing. He hadn't touched the button. He grabbed the camera, his hands shaking so hard he almost dropped it. He rushed back to the darkroom, the need to see what the camera had captured overriding his fear. He developed the film in record time, his movements mechanical, his count a frantic whisper. When the image appeared, he felt his throat tighten. It wasn't a photo of his loft. It was a photo of a brick wall, the mortar crumbling, the shadows deep and hungry. But the architecture was wrong. The angles were impossible, the perspective shifting in ways that made his eyes ache. It was a dark, distorted version of Chicago, a negative realm where the sun never rose and the wind never stopped howling. In the center of the frame, a door was slightly ajar, and a pair of pale, translucent hands gripped the edge of the wood. A violent crash from the front of the loft sent Elias sprinting back out. A man was standing in the center of the room, swinging a heavy metal pipe at the remaining shelves. He was mid-30s, but looked decades older, his clothes moth-eaten and smelling of ozone. Michael Davis. He swung the pipe again, smashing a collection of vintage light meters. "Give it to me!" he screamed, his eyes darting to the corners of the ceiling. "I have to end the cycle. We have to go back." He lunged at Elias, the pipe whistling through the air. Elias ducked, the metal whistling past his ear, and grabbed a heavy tripod, using it like a quarterstaff to keep the intruder at bay. They scrambled across the floor, a desperate, clumsy struggle amidst the wreckage of the studio. Michael was surprisingly strong, fueled by a manic, terrifying energy. He managed to pin Elias against the wall, the metal pipe pressing against Elias's throat. "You don't understand." Michael sobbed, his face inches from Elias's. "My brother. He's in the glass. I can hear him hitting the walls. October 12th, O'Hare Terminal. I was there. I let him go." Sarah moved then, showing a strength Elias didn't know she possessed. She swung a heavy ledger, the very one they had found, and caught Michael across the temple. He slumped to the floor, the pipe clattering away. Elias stood over him, gasping for air, his throat burning. 1,000, 2, 1,000. He watched as Michael curled into a fetal position, weeping openly. "I just wanted to save him," Michael whispered, his voice breaking. "The passenger, it isn't one ghost, Elias. It's all of them. Everyone the camera ever took. It's a collective, a legion of the erased. And they're hungry. They want to be solid again. They want to breathe your air." The weight of the words hit Elias harder than the pipe ever could. He looked at the Leica sitting on the workbench, its lens reflecting the bruised purple light of the Chicago evening. It wasn't just a camera. It was a hungry glass mouth. The air in the loft began to thin, the vacuum effect Michael had warned about finally taking hold. It was as if the room itself was being sucked into the lens. Elias felt the oxygen leave his blood, his vision blurring at the edges. "The ledger," he wheezed, crawling toward the book. "The formulas." He flipped through the pages, his eyes landing on a section hidden behind a series of chemical diagrams. Silver halide dissolution, a final wash. It was a recipe for a corrosive acid, a mixture so volatile it would eat through metal and bone alike. "It can blind it," he told Sarah, who was slumped against the wall, her face a terrifying shade of gray. "If I dissolve the film while it's being exposed, I can break the medium." He scrambled into the darkroom, his hands fumbling with the bottles of chemicals. He had to be precise. One wrong drop and the whole thing would erupt in a cloud of toxic gas. He started the count, his voice a ragged anchor in the encroaching dark. 1,000, sulfuric acid. 2, 1,000, nitric. As he stirred the mixture, the red safety light began to flicker and hum. The shadows in the corner of the dark room began to bleed together, rising up like a wave of ink. The passenger was no longer just in the glass. It was in the room, a towering, three-dimensional void that filled the small space with the scent of scorched dust and old tobacco. The entity struck with the force of a physical blow. Elias was thrown back against the chemical racks, the sound of shattering glass like a symphony of failure. He felt the sharp sting of developer fluid soaking into his shirt, the caustic burn of the acid splashing across his forearm. He lay on the floor, gasping, as the passenger loomed over him. It didn't have a face, but he could feel its gaze, a cold, focused intent that made his skin crawl. It reached out, its smoke-like fingers wrapping around his throat. He couldn't breathe. The world was turning white, the edges of his vision sparkling with the static of a dying television. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Elias kicked out, knocking a heavy tray of fixer into the entity's path. The shadow recoiled, the liquid passing through it, but causing a momentary ripple in its form. Elias scrambled to his feet and lunged for the exit, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. He burst out of the darkroom, the door slamming shut behind him. He stood in the loft, gasping for air, his chest heaving. He had the mixture. He had the plan. He just needed to get to the Leica. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. Elias saw the camera sitting on the central table, its lens catching the flickering light of the city. He knew exactly what to do. He would grab the Leica, bring it back into the darkroom, and submerge it in the acid bath while firing the flash. It was a logical, surgical strike. By overexposing the film at the exact moment of its destruction, he would create a feedback loop that would burn the entity out of existence. He had the technical mastery, the chemicals, and the timing. He felt a surge of cold, focused confidence. He was a forensic investigator's son. He understood that details saved lives. He reached for the camera, his fingers inches from the leather casing, ready to end the nightmare once and for all. Phase 2. False positive. The door to the loft buzzed, and then the heavy lock clicked open. Jennifer walked in, her face bright with a surprise smile, a bouquet of sunflowers in one hand. Surprise! I know you've been working late, so I thought. She stopped, seeing the wreckage of the studio, but then her eyes landed on the Leica. Oh, is this the new find? It's beautiful, Elias. She picked it up before he could scream a warning. She looked through the viewfinder, her finger resting naturally on the shutter. Stay right there. You look so dramatic in this light. She laughed, a sound of pure, untainted joy. Click, hiss. The flash fired, a blinding strobe of white that illuminated the dust and the cracks in the mirrors. Elias felt a wave of relief. She was here. She was safe. The camera hadn't killed her. Maybe the curse was broken. Maybe his fear had been the only thing giving the shadow power. Phase 3. The crack. Elias stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to take the camera. Jen, honey, give me that. It's delicate. He stopped. Something was wrong. Jennifer wasn't moving. She was still holding the camera to her eye, but her posture had gone rigid, like a statue carved from ice. The sunflowers slipped from her hand, the yellow petals scattering across the floor like drops of spilled paint. A low, vibrating hum began to fill the room, the funeral dirge of the passenger. Elias looked at the lens of the Leica. The glass wasn't reflecting the room anymore. It was swirling with a deep, oily blackness. A cold prickle danced across his skin as he realized the flash hadn't been a mistake. It had been an invitation. Phase 4. Full collapse. The truth hit Elias like a physical blow to the stomach. The entity didn't just want him, it wanted a subject. By taking his photo, Jennifer hadn't just activated the camera. She had signed her own death warrant. The passenger didn't care about the photographer. It cared about the image. The shadow didn't manifest behind Elias this time. It erupted from the floor directly behind Jennifer, its ink-black hands wrapping around her throat before she could even scream. She dropped the Leica, her hands flying to her neck, her face turning a terrifying bruised purple as the entity began to drain the very air from her lungs. No! Elias lunged for her, but his hands passed right through the shadow as if it were made of cold mist. He was powerless. Jennifer was being lifted off the ground, her feet dangling, her eyes wide with a terror that broke Elias's heart. The entity was untouchable, a creature of light and chemistry that existed only in the medium of the film. By trying to be smart, by leaving the camera out, Elias had handed the passenger a new, fresher soul to consume. He hadn't solved the problem. He had moved the target to the person he loved most. The police were pounding on the door now, alerted by the neighbors to the screaming and the crashes. But they were a world away. Inside the loft, the air was gone, and Jennifer was dying in the grip of a ghost Elias had invited into their lives. The flash! Elias screamed, his voice a ghost of a sound. He scrambled for the Leica on the floor. He didn't have time for the dark room. He grabbed the bottle of corrosive acid from the workbench and poured it directly into the open back of the camera. The film sizzled, a foul-smelling smoke rising from the casing. He pointed the lens at the passenger and forced the flash to fire again and again. White. Whiteness. White. The room exploded in a series of blinding strobes. The entity shrieked, a metallic, high-speed clicking that vibrated in Elias's teeth. The film dissolved into a black, bubbling sludge, the silver halides screaming as the acid ate through the memories of 100 erased souls. The passenger began to fray at the edges, its solid form turning back into a smudge, then a blur, then nothing. Jennifer collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her chest heaving as the vacuum finally broke. The shadow vanished, leaving behind nothing but the smell of ozone and the bitter tang of chemicals. Elias slumped against the wall, his hands burned and bleeding, his count finally reaching 0. The police burst through the door, guns drawn, seeing a man covered in acid and a woman unconscious on the floor. They didn't see the shadow. They didn't see the negative realm. They only saw the wreckage of a life. Weeks later, Elias walked through Millennium Park, the wind off the lake biting into his skin. He wore thick, dark glasses, not to see better, but to see less. He kept his gaze fixed on the pavement, avoiding the silver reflections of the cloud gate sculpture and the glass walls of the skyscrapers. He had destroyed the Leica, but the world felt different now. The edges were blurred, the details dishonest. He knew that while the bridge was gone, the passenger was still there, lurking in the corner of every shop window, waiting for someone else to pick up a lens and try to capture the truth. He didn't count the seconds anymore. He just watched the shadows, and for the first time in his life, he let them stay blurry.